Okay, so I'm picking up on sleep deprivation. This is the part where we talk about some of the experiments that were done, just to kind of break up some of these videos and these lectures. So the this is something that people tend to get very interested in. This is kind of a neat thing to talk about, and that is this: what's the longest that we know of somebody not getting sleep, right? That's what everybody wants to know. Well, how much sleep do I really need? But then really, how long can I go without sleep? So I'm going to talk about this particular experiment that was done. And it really started out as not really an experiment. It started out as a science experiment, like a high school kid. So at the right here, at the bottom right, this is Randy Gardner. And he was a 17-year-old high school student from San Diego, California. And he was interested in staying awake for a high school experiment, science experiment for his school. And so it came out that he had made this announcement that he wanted to do this experiment and he wanted to stay awake. Remember, this was done in the 1960s, I believe. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it was done in the 1960s. And he was interested in staying awake as long as he could. And so when William Dement, or Bill Dement, caught wind of this experiment that he wanted to do, they immediately called him up and said, "Hey, do you mind if we come and we just monitor you? Because we'd like to see what kind of experiment, we'd like to kind of see what happens when you deprive yourself of sleep." And so George Golovich is also a colleague of Dement's and came and assisted with the experiment. So when we look at the amount of time that he actually spent awake, okay, so he was awake 11 days and 24 minutes, which is about 264 hours. He shattered the world record, and is now in the Guinness Book of World Records. And this is not, he will be the sole record holder for the rest of time. Guinness Book of World Records has basically stated that this record is closed and they're not allowing anybody to attempt to break it because ethically it's not a good idea. They think it's too harmful to attempt. So at this point, he will be the record holder forever, even if somebody is able to beat it. They're not going to acknowledge it. So the previous record holder was Peter Tripp, who was a DJ from New York, and he's on the left there, and his record was 200 hours. Now, the bad thing about Peter Tripp is that he was actually the reason why we have a lot of myths and incorrect assumptions about sleep deprivation. He actually ruined a lot of the research because of the experiences that he had. So Peter Tripp, who was awake for 200 hours, he really, it was a very not well controlled experiment. He did it as a publicity stunt, and he was given illicit drugs while he was trying to stay awake. And he hallucinated a lot, and he really had some really crazy things happen to him while he was awake. And so this kind of led people to believe that if you are to stay awake for a really extended period of time, that you're going to go crazy. And really, he did hallucinate and he did have a lot of problems, but that's probably because of all of the hallucinogenic drugs he was taking at the time of this experiment. And so it wasn't really a quote unquote traditional experiment. It was a publicity stunt to get people to view, to basically to tune in to his show. So the Peter Tripp one, I mean, yes, he had the record for a period of time, but I just feel like it's one of those ones that did more harm than good. Now, Randy Gardner's experiment was the one that really taught us a lot. It still wasn't the best, but it did give us a lot of information, mostly because Dement and Golovich were there to be able to monitor him. So some interesting things that we discovered about the Randy Gardner was that during his time of sleep deprivation, he actually experienced no psychotic symptoms. So he did not hallucinate. He didn't go crazy. He wasn't, he didn't suddenly start sawing off his arm or anything weird like that. But he did become very irritable. And usually these These episodes occurred at peak melatonin release, which is about 3 a.m. to 7 a.m. And he experienced things like really extreme anger. He would say things like, "Why are you making me do this? All I want to do is go to sleep. Please leave me alone." And, Dement was just like, "We're just here to monitor you. This is what you want to do." And he would get very, very upset. And just, experience these sort of bouts of irritability. But then as soon as sort of 7, 8 a.m. rolled around, he was himself again, and he'd apologize. "I'm really sorry that I was really irritable," and things like that. Now, they found that there were some areas that were affected, and of course, these were varying degrees. So some of these were affected more than others. For example, his ability to analyze things, his memory was affected pretty substantially. His idea of perception and being able to perceive different things, his motivation, as well as being able to control his motor movements. One thing that they did a lot of is play basketball. So Randy Gardner liked playing basketball, and he wanted to play basketball to help him try to maintain being awake. And so that was something that, of course, that he did throughout those 11 days to try to keep himself awake. And they found that during periods of time, he wasn't able to, make shots, and his motor control was really off. Now, after this occurred, Bill Dement went back and said, "I really think that," because we didn't really know about this at the time, but what ended up happening was Bill Dement realized that what was probably happening to Randy Gardner was he was actually experiencing microsleeps. And so a microsleep is when you're really, really tired and you kind of blank out for a second. Okay. So it's like somebody's talking to you and you're just kind of quiet, and you stop talking. You could stop talking mid-sentence, and you just kind of wander off. Right? And so these microsleeps are essentially the brain shutting off temporarily because it's not able to get sleep in. So Bill Dement really believed that Randy Gardner, the reason why he was able to go this long was he was actually experiencing microsleeps throughout the entire time. But they weren't able to measure that, and they didn't consider that at the time. But Bill Dement said that he wished he'd been able to go back and sort of measure this. So once Randy Gardner finished his period of time and decided, "Okay, I'm done. I'm going to fall asleep now." Okay. Bill Dement was like, "Please, please, please let us take you back to our lab and let us see how you recover." So you had 11 days without sleep. Okay. So when they asked Randy how much sleep he typically needed throughout the night, he said, "Well, I usually get a little less than 7 hours sleep, and I feel good." And they said, "Okay, so if you miss that much sleep over the course of 11 days, we're gonna say this is approximately 75 hours that you have missed over the course of a week and a half." So in night one, they thought, well, if he needs to make this sleep up hour by hour, he's going to be sleeping nonstop and to make up the 75 hours. So they expected that the amount of recovery sleep he would need in the first week to 2 weeks was going to be pretty substantial. That's what they were thinking in order for him to make up the sleep debt. He has 75 hours to make up, and he still has to get in about 7 hours, a little less than 7 hours per night on top of that, just to get back to his recovery period. So during the first night, Randy slept. The first night he was allowed to sleep, a full night's sleep, after the sleep deprivation experiment. He slept 14 hours and 40 minutes. The second night, he slept 10 hours and 30 minutes. And then after 1 week, he was back to his normal less than 7 hours per night. So it took him a week, and he really did not make up anywhere near that 75 hours that he missed. So they tested him 1, 6, and 10 weeks after the event. And after that first week, he was completely back to normal. And he didn't seem to have any effects of that really prolonged sleep deprivation. So the interesting thing is that what this ended up showing us that, for at least some people, extreme sleep deprivation is not something that really is not something that's going to lead to necessarily death, but it's going to lead to problems. It's definitely not going to, it may not lead to hallucinating, but there have been experiments that have shown that with severe sleep deprivation, multiple days, that people do tend to have their perceptions altered so much that it would be hallucinations. So there's a lot of contradictory evidence. With the Randy Gardner experiment, we found that he did not have any hallucinations or psychotic symptoms. But in other severe sleep deprivation studies, we have found that that's a possibility. That people could have some really severe and warped perceptions to the point where they're actually hallucinating. However, we don't really see these psychotic symptoms in normal healthy participants in these more severe sleep studies, sleep deprivation studies. But we definitely don't have the Peter Tripp stuff going on where they're being psychotic and they're acting, like super, super crazy. We think those were mostly due to the hallucinogenic drugs he was taking to keep him awake, and combinations of drugs that he was taking to keep him awake. So the studies that we have done of looking at continuous sleep deprivation, we see things like alpha waves being reduced as when you're awake. As you continue getting more and more tired, those alpha waves are decreasing. And we also see that the slow waves are increasing, theta waves are increasing during sleep, essentially putting you into a deeper and more efficient sleep. Beta waves seem to be relatively unchanged throughout the day, day-to-day awakeness. And like I said, we see these micro sleeps occurring that Bill Dement thought that was occurring during Randy Gardner, but he wasn't aware of those at the time. We're seeing that after about 40 continuous hours without sleep, we're seeing these micro sleeps starting to occur. And unless you are really, 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 really trying, they sort of take over you, or take you over. So it's very difficult. And again, some of the studies that we're seeing after 4 nights of sleep deprivation, we're seeing some hallucinations, some depersonalization, and some delusions, depending on the population that we're studying. And again, not all of these are completely consistent, but we aren't seeing the severe psychotic symptoms that we saw, for example, in Peter Tripp. So there's a debate, and I said this kind of previously about the whole, like, if you go without sleep, you're not going to die. We don't know that for sure. In this week, you guys are going to take a look at some of the conditions that you could have that are sleep conditions. One of them is called fatal familial insomnia. So one of you might argue with me, well, fatal familial insomnia, if you stop sleeping, you die. Well, I'd have to argue that that's not necessarily the case, because in fatal familial insomnia, there's such brain damage that occurs that there's no way for us to definitively say that it's sleep alone or the lack of sleep alone that kills you, because there's so many other areas of the brain. There's so many other functions that particular affected area of the brain controls, body temperature, things like that we know that in of itself is damaging. So it's arguable if the complete lack of sleep leads to absolute death, but it certainly contributes. We all have experienced some form of sleep deprivation. We feel, disoriented, irritable. We can be paranoid and feel tired and lethargic and kind of sick. You have this ability where you're not able to experience pleasure. Somebody might say something really fun or happy, let's go do this, and it's just not as fun because you're so tired. And here we can see a lot of the kinds of things that happen when you are sleep deprived. Things aren't as funny. You're not as good at stuff. If you're playing a game, you tend to not be very, very good at it. If you're playing video games and you're sleep deprived, you tend to make a lot of mistakes, for example. You don't really want to socialize. You're not peppy and happy because you're tired. You might be, clumsy. And you might not be able to cope with situations as good as you would had you not been sleep deprived. We also have problems concentrating. We're not as decisive. We could distort reality, kind of like how if you engage in drinking alcohol, you can distort reality. Same kind of thing. When you're super sleepy and drowsy, you don't pay much attention to people's behavioral cues, and that can kind of set you up for a problem. We also see that people tend to have problems with logic, not very good memories. You're not as creative and flexible, and you can actually pass out when you're tired. We see, of course, in biologically speaking, physiologically speaking, your body temperature drops. You might experience heart palpitations where your heart's kind of thumping out of your chest. Your eyelids will droop because it's hard for you to stay awake. Your eyes will itch. Number one thing that you can see in a child who's sleepy is they start rubbing their eyes. They're getting sleepy. You also see people tremor, which is kind of like they'll shake, like their hands may shake. Very similar to when you have a drop in blood sugar. We also see weight gain. People who have experienced sleep deprivation over a period of time or have not been getting sufficient sleep over a period of time do tend to gain weight. There's been studies that show that people who are sleep deprived or who are getting insufficient sleep actually crave sugary and salty and fatty foods. And then when those individuals are given the chance to make up sleep and sleep at a normal level, those same people will at that point, once they're getting healthy sleep, start craving things that are healthy for them, like fruit and vegetables. So it actually, being sleep deprived can actually change the kinds of foods that we crave and that we want and that we consume. And so if you're more likely to crave sweet stuff and salty stuff and fatty stuff when you're sleep deprived, then that's going to make you gain weight. And it's also going to be harder for our bodies to fight off that extra weight. So when we look at people who are chronically sleep deprived over a very long period of time, who maybe they get 4 or 5 hours of sleep per night, but they should be getting 8 hours of sleep. We see cardiovascular problems, so heart conditions. We see people gaining weight. Of course, sleep deprivation is going to impact leptin, which is going to affect how hungry you are. So you're going to be more likely to not only crave those bad foods, just simply be hungrier because you're sleep deprived. And we also see that it can affect your sleep deprivation. Chronic sleep deprivation can affect your glucose tolerance. And what that essentially does is it puts you at a higher risk for diabetes. It puts you at a higher risk for not being able to process the sugars in foods that keeps you going and keeps your energy going. And you don't process that as well. And so here are some other health issues. For example, we see brain inflammation, and there's actually a very interesting link to Alzheimer's and sleep. And one thing that we know that sleep does is when you give your body the chance to sleep properly in the amount of hours that you really need, during the process, your brain is clearing out a lot of the junk that it accumulates during the day. So our cells are continually, going through cycles. And some cells die, some cells get damaged, some cells get repaired. And what ends up happening is that sort of trash, it needs to be cleared out. And this is every cell, all the cells in our body go through these different processes. And so your body is prepared and able to clear out these toxins just normally throughout the day. And so one thing that we know is at night when you're sleeping, your body does this. This is like one of the periods of times that it clears it out. And for example, in your brain, it's clearing out toxins as you sleep. When you don't give yourself the chance to do that, when you don't give your brain the chance to clear out those toxins, what ends up happening is they accumulate. So one theory about Alzheimer's is that it could actually be related to sleep disorders, and a sleep disorder in the sense that you're so chronically sleep deprived that over the course of decades, your brain has not cleared out these toxins, and then they end up building up in the brain. And so again, this is one of the theories. There's a lot of theories as to why Alzheimer's exists, or the causes. But this could explain some of the issues that people who have chronic sleep deprivation could have some of these health issues. So we know that, those chronically sleep deprived people tend to also have increased brain inflammation, which is related to not clearing out some of these toxins. And we also call it systemic inflammation when the inflammation is so bad it's actually in your blood, it's throughout your body. And so we also know that, for example, mood is impacted by sleep, and the neurotransmitters in your brain really need consistency, and they need proper sleep to be able to be in the right balance. And so we know that for people who are sleep deprived, it's related to their mood, which then relates to how much sleep they get, which is related to their mood, and it's the cycle that just keeps going on and on and on. So we know that mood, depression, anxiety is all related to how much sleep that you're getting. We also see issues with digestion, and cortisol is a hormone that we produce in response to stress. And we know that if you're not getting enough sleep, then of course you are actually potentially creating a situation for imbalance of hormones. And so that can affect your digestion. It also affects your metabolic health, and can lead you at risk for metabolic syndrome, which, for example, insulin resistance can put you at risk for diabetes. We also see, like I said before, your appetite being impacted, and metabolism will get slowed down as well. And we also see that lack of consistent sleep is related to cancer. Individuals who are shift workers tend to have a much higher rate of health, of heart disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, men, prostate cancer, and women, breast cancer. And there's a lot of studies out there that show these associations between not getting consistent sleep at the right time, not getting enough sleep as well, could affect the physiological happenings in the body. And so these are all, some things that I think you should definitely consider. And hopefully what you've seen here is that it's very important to get not only the amount of sleep that your body needs, which can be different from person to person, there are individual differences there, but also to get it consistently. So it's one thing to know, okay, my body needs about, 7.5 hours of sleep per night, but to get that every night, try to go to bed at the same time, try to wake up at the same time. We know that consistency is very important for all of the physiological processes in your body, because all of that has a particular biological rhythm. So if you have any questions, of course, you can certainly put them on the question forum, or you can email me directly, just let me know. But hopefully you enjoyed this series of lectures, so have a good week.